The rain had fallen all night, a steady, miserable rain, and when at last the light grew to the point that he could see his troops, George Washington realized that 7 of them were lost in the forest, God knew where. For hours he had blundered through the dripping dark, time and again leading the little column off the trail, sometimes taking a quarter hour just to grope his way back to the track. Confused, untrained, and wretched, the 40 soldiers who had somehow held together through the night were hardly prepared to fight any enemy, let alone one experienced in forest warfare. Nonetheless, the tall Virginian led them on, following the Indian warrior who had come to warn them of their peril. Toward daybreak the rain stopped, and the remnants of Washington's patrol reached the Indian camp. There the soldiers dried and loaded their muskets, while Washington conferred with the old chief who had summoned him. Tanagrisson, called the Half-King by the English, who regarded him as an ally, described the tracks he had seen nearby. They led toward a sheltered place he knew. There he suspected the French had been bivouacked since the day before. Washington's soldiers could march to a spot nearby and wait while his own men reconnoitered. Once the warriors knew the enemy's strength and disposition, they and the Virginians could fall on the camp together. Washington agreed. He had no choice. However little he cared for Indians, however little he trusted them, he could never have found the Frenchmen's camp without them. Surely he could not have found it in time to dispose his men in firing positions while the French, groggy with sleep, were just starting to cook breakfast at the foot of a tall rock face. Quietly his men and the Indians stationed themselves above and around the narrow glen, while on its floor Frenchmen still crawled from their bark lean-tos and stretched themselves in the early light. As always in such affairs, no one knows exactly what happened next. Perhaps, as the French later said, the English fired on them without warning. Or perhaps, as Washington maintained, a Frenchman shouted a warning that sent his comrades flying to their arms and firing up into the woods. All that is certain is that the English fired 2 volleys down into the hollow, while the French returned a few ragged shots and tried to retreat into the shelter of the trees. But there was no escape. The Half-King's warriors had blocked the path, forcing the 30-odd Frenchmen back into the clearing, where English fire pinned them down. An officer called for quarter, and Washington ordered his men to cease firing. Perhaps 10 minutes had passed since the first shot. It had been a lopsided skirmish. Around the rim of the hollow, 3 of Washington's troops were wounded, and 1 lay dead. At its bottom the French had suffered 14 casualties. One of the wounded, a 35-year-old ensign named Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville, identified himself as the detachment's commander. Through a translator he tried to make it known that he had come in peace, as an emissary with a message summoning the English to withdraw from the possessions of His Most Christian Majesty, Louis XV. The letter he carried would make everything clear. His interpreter would read it. As the combatants' adrenaline levels subsided and the wounded men moaned, the translation went badly. The letter had to be read a second time, and Washington turned to take it back to his own translator. As he withdrew, Tanagrisson stepped up to where Jumonville lay. "Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père," he said. "Thou art not yet dead, my father." He raised his hatchet and sank it in the ensign's head, striking until he had shattered the cranium. Then he reached into the skull, pulled out a handful of viscous tissue, and washed his hands in Jumonville's brain. The tall Virginian, who until that instant had thought himself in command, did nothing, while the Half-King's warriors, as if on signal, set about killing the wounded. Within moments, only one of the Frenchmen who had been hit in the firefight was left alive. Recovering his composure, Washington now salvaged what he could by forming his men around the 21 surviving prisoners and hustling them to safety. Behind them, in the bloody hollow, the Half-King's men scalped and stripped the 13 corpses, decapitating one and impaling its head on a stake. Then they too abandoned the glen, and crows flapped noisily down from the trees to begin the feast. Soon wolves would lope in to do their part. Eventually maggots and beetles and ants would finish the job, in meticulous silence. By afternoon, Washington was back at his own camp, groping for explanations and trying to plan his next move. Since boyhood he had dreamed of battle's glory. Now he had seen combat, but no heroism, only chaos and the slaughter of defenseless men. Why had it happened? What could he tell his superiors? What would happen next? George Washington had none of the answers.